Watch a pigeon on a city sidewalk sometime. A person walks straight at it, footsteps loud, shadow falling right across its body, and the pigeon doesn't even flinch. It just steps aside, almost bored, like you're a slow-moving piece of furniture. Every other wild bird on Earth treats a human like a predator. A sparrow bolts. A crow keeps its distance and watches you like a threat assessment in progress. But a pigeon in a city square will walk up and stand on your shoe. That should be strange. That should be evolutionarily insane. And once you understand what pigeons actually are and where they actually came from, you start to realize you're not looking at a bird that's simply gotten used to people. You're looking at one of the strangest, longest-running experiments in fearlessness that evolution has ever produced, and we ran it completely by accident. Here's the part almost nobody knows. Every pigeon strutting around your local plaza is not, technically, a wild animal at all. It's the descendant of the rock dove, a bird that originally lived exclusively on sheer coastal cliffs, nesting in narrow rocky ledges, feeding on seeds across open ground, and staying about as far from large mammals as a bird can physically get. Picture the original version of this animal. A compact gray bird clinging to a crack in a sea cliff 100 feet above crashing water, choosing that spot specifically because almost nothing on four legs could climb up to reach it. Rock doves were never supposed to like us. If anything, cliffs were their entire survival strategy. Get high, get inaccessible, stay where the things with teeth and claws can't easily follow. Foxes, wildcats, snakes, anything that hunted by climbing or stalking on the ground simply couldn't get to a nest wedged into a vertical rock face. For millions of years, that strategy worked exactly as intended. The birds that picked the highest, narrowest, most inconvenient ledges survived to raise chicks. The birds that nested somewhere easier got found. Height was safety. Distance from anything large and warm-blooded was safety. That was the entire rulebook, and it had nothing whatsoever to do with trusting a giant, unpredictable primate walking around on the ground below. So how did a cliff bird end up completely unbothered by the loudest, most chaotic species on the planet, standing 2 feet from a food cart, while pigeons everywhere else evolved into what we'd now call the city's most successful wild animal? The answer starts further back than you'd expect. At Gorham's cave on the coast of Gibraltar, archaeologists found evidence that Neanderthals were eating rock doves as far back as 67,000 years ago, and kept doing it for tens of thousands of years after that. Long before modern humans existed as we know them, another species of human was already living alongside these cliff-dwelling birds, hunting them out of the very rock ledges the birds had chosen specifically to avoid predators like us. Think about how strange that timeline actually is. 67,000 years is deep enough into the past that it predates agriculture, predates cities, predates almost every technology we'd recognize as human civilization. And yet the relationship between our species and this particular bird was already underway, tens of thousands of years before either side had any concept of what it was becoming. The cliffs the rock doves had chosen for safety turned out to have one flaw. Nothing in their evolutionary history had prepared them for. A hominid species clever enough and patient enough to climb up after them anyway. That's already strange, but it's what happened next that actually explains the pigeon standing on your shoe today. Somewhere between 3 and 10,000 years ago, humans in the Mediterranean and the Fertile Crescent started deliberately keeping rock doves. Not taming them the way you'd tame a dog, slowly, generation after generation, through careful selection, more like discovering that these birds basically walked into the arrangement themselves. Humans built grain stores, humans built temples with tall stone walls and high ledges, and to a bird whose entire evolutionary programming said, find a cliff, nest on a ledge, stay above ground predators, a granary wall or a temple facade looked exactly like home. Except this new kind of cliff came with an unlimited buffet of spilled grain sitting right at the base of it. The rock dove didn't have to be tricked into this. It had to be barely nudged. Its ancient preference for cliffs and ledges turned out to be, completely by coincidence, the exact preference that would make it thrive around human architecture thousands of years before anyone had a word for domestication. By around 4500 BC, Egyptian hieroglyphics and Mesopotamian artifacts already show humans actively keeping pigeons, not as passive scavengers tolerated at the edges of a town, but as a bird woven into daily life, used for meat, for messages, eventually for sport and companionship. Some researchers even argue rock doves were likely domesticated independently, more than once, in different regions across their range, over a span of thousands of years, rather than tamed a single time in a single place and spread outward. The bird kept arriving at the same arrangement with humans over and over, in places that had never communicated with each other, simply because the underlying instinct was already sitting there, ready to be triggered by the right kind of architecture. And every one of those human uses required something the truly wild rock dove didn't have. It required a bird that could tolerate constant close contact with people and not burn all its energy panicking every single time a human walked past. Here's where the real selection pressure kicks in. And it's not so different from the story of the fox farm experiment you may have already seen, except this one happened over thousands of years, in plain sight, with nobody running a controlled study. The birds that could stay calm near people got fed. They got protected from actual predators, the hawks and cats that still saw pigeons as prey. They got to breed more often, in safer conditions, producing more clutches per year than their wild cliff-dwelling cousins ever could. Every generation, the birds wired to relax around humans outcompeted the ones wired to bolt. And crucially, some of those pigeons didn't stay in captivity. Domesticated and semi-domesticated birds escaped or were deliberately released, again and again across thousands of years of human history. Messenger birds that never made it home, breeding stock that got loose, birds simply set free once they'd served whatever purpose they were kept for. And every time, they carried that same calm around humans wiring back out into the world with them. Which means the modern city pigeon isn't a wild bird that slowly adapted to cities from the outside, the way a fox or a raccoon did. It's the feral descendant of a population that had already been selected intensively for tolerating us, long before it ever needed to survive on a sidewalk. The fearlessness came first. The city came later, and simply gave that fearlessness somewhere new to be useful. That's the twist that makes this different from almost every other urban wildlife story. A city fox or a city raccoon is a wild animal learning, within its own lifetime, that humans aren't as dangerous as they used to assume. That's flexibility. That's behavior. The pigeon isn't doing that. The pigeon inherited its calm. Somewhere in its genes is the accumulated result of thousands of years of humans, completely unintentionally, filtering out the birds that couldn't handle being close to us. Which brings us back to that pigeon standing on your shoe, completely unbothered while you tower over it. It's not naive. It's not simply used to the city. It is, in a very real sense, running the oldest, most successful, let's just see what happens if we live near giant, unpredictable mammals experiment any bird has ever pulled off. And it won, so thoroughly that pigeons now live on every continent except Antarctica, thriving specifically in the environments humans build. And the buildings themselves tell the same story the granaries once did. A ledge on a 20-story office tower is functionally identical to a pigeon's ancient cliff-nesting instincts to a rock face on the Mediterranean coast. Every skyscraper you've ever seen covered in pigeon droppings isn't an accident of convenience. It's a bird recognizing exactly the kind of terrain its ancestors evolved to nest on, just built out of concrete and glass instead of stone. The gap beneath an air conditioning unit, the underside of a highway overpass, the narrow ledge above a shop window, each one reads to a pigeon's ancient instincts as a perfectly serviceable crack in a cliff face, sheltered, elevated, and out of easy reach. We didn't invent a new habitat for pigeons. We accidentally built thousands of artificial cliffs in exactly the shape their instincts were already looking for, and then filled the ground beneath them with more food than any wild cliffside ever offered.
It's worth pausing on how total that mismatch of intention actually is. Every architect who ever designed a ledge, a cornice, or a rooftop overhang was solving a completely different problem. Drainage, structural support, aesthetics, nothing to do with birds at all. And yet, from a pigeon's perspective, human cities accidentally became the single richest cliff-nesting habitat that has ever existed on the planet. Layered floor after floor, running for miles in every direction, with food scattered across the ground below every single one of them.
There's something almost uncomfortable about how well this worked. We didn't set out to build the perfect, fearless bird breeding program. Nobody in ancient Mesopotamia was thinking about neural pathways or startle responses. They wanted eggs and meat and messages carried across long distances. But every single one of those wants required the same underlying trait, generation after generation. And evolution doesn't care what your intentions were. It only cares what trait keeps getting fed and keeps getting to breed. Calm around humans wasn't a side effect anyone chose. It was simply the trait that kept winning, silently, for thousands of years, until it became the default setting for an entire species. So the next time you watch a pigeon stroll past your feet without a hint of fear, you're not watching an animal that's simply given up on caution. You're watching the end result of one of the oldest, longest, and strangest selection experiments humans have ever run without realizing we were running one. A bird that traded a life on remote sea cliffs for a life on window ledges and sidewalks, because somewhere in the deep math of survival, staying close to us turned out to be the safest cliff it ever found.